Good evening. My name is Patricia Wood. I'm a member of the Executive Committee at the Robarts Centre for Canadian Studies and a co-coordinator of the Civis Research Cluster on Urban Governance and Citizenship. And so on behalf of the Robarts Centre, I'm pleased to welcome you all to our panel this evening on municipal governance and the future of housing. We begin this evening by acknowledging that the land on which York University sits has been the residence and traditional territory of several First Nations and many Indigenous peoples, including the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and the Haudenosaunee, and we recognize the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit. The area where Toronto sits and extending around the Great Lakes is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant and Wampum Belt, an agreement first among Indigenous nations in the region, and now an agreement that obliges all of us here to share and to serve as stewards for the land, taking only what we need and committing ourselves to peaceful relationships with each other. Universities and other researchers have a particular obligation to recognize their colonial pasts and the role of research and teaching in the perpetuation of the racism and genocide of settler colonialism. Knowledge production is always a political act. So as we listen and participate in tonight's panel on housing and the question of municipal governments using the tool of appropriation, we should also be mindful of the fundamental fact that the land in question is the same land whose Indigenous claims we just acknowledged, and that tonight's discussions do not take place on some other separate plane from those grounded political realities. In acknowledging the land, we also acknowledge our obligations to that land and to each other, and we should keep these in mind both this evening and afterwards in our own work and our own lives. Tonight's event was organized in collaboration with the City Institute at York University and the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. So I will now turn it over to Jessica Parrish from the FMTA to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Patricia. My name is Jessica Parrish, as Patricia mentioned, and I'm on the board of directors of the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. I just wanted to take a minute and say that even though we're all sort of sheltering in place and sitting in isolated rooms in front of computers, I see about 105 participants are online right now. And so it's great that we're also in another way part of a group of people who care quite a bit about social and affordable housing. So the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations, it was founded in 1974 and is the largest and oldest tenant federation in Canada. And it exists to advocate for the rights of tenants in the city. And we provide a couple of, we provide a number of services, a couple of which I'll just highlight quickly. And one is a tenant hotline. And we also run a series of tenant schools throughout the year, 3 times a year. And it just so happens that our next tenant school will be next week. And so if you want to learn more about that or about the FMTA, please visit torontotenants.org. I also just wanted to say a couple of quick words about the genesis of this panel and its significance. The idea, the catalyst for this panel was a report that was written by an FMTA volunteer who is a speaker on this panel and who you will meet shortly. The report was published by the FMTA in September, and it's entitled Taking Back Our Housing. And that report makes a case for using expropriation, municipal expropriation powers to expand the supply of social and affordable housing in Toronto. And for me, and also I think somewhat to echo some of Patricia's remarks, one of the key takeaways of that report that comes up is that if we're talking about expropriation in the context of housing and home, we are, I think, of necessity always talking about expropriation in two senses that are similar but distinct but related. And the first, of course, is the legal sense of municipalities having the ability to compel the sale of property in order to advance a public policy objective. But the other sense of expropriation is the processes, which are much more general and unfortunately widespread, whereby historically and also in the present, poor people, working people, Indigenous people, racialized people, and others are pushed out of their homes and their communities and pushed off of their traditional lands. So I think that the panel tonight and all the speakers in their various ways are really going to be directing our attention to really fundamental issues of land, property, power, who benefits and who gets to sit at the table and participate in these extremely consequential decisions. So without further ado, I will pass it over to William Jenkins, who is the interim director of the City Institute and associate professor of history at York University.
Thanks very much for that, Jessica. Hi, everybody. I'm William Jenkins, the interim director of the City Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here. We were established as an organized research unit at York in 2006, and we're a community of affiliated university professors, graduate students, senior undergraduates, visiting scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and we all share an interest, of course, in collaborative, interdisciplinary and critical urban research. And despite the realities of COVID-19, we are carrying on with our research as best we can. Like much of the rest of York, we're operating in a virtual capacity, and our researchers are engaged in projects that look at issues of urbanization and gender in the global south, also issues of suburbanization in Canada and other parts of the world, the phenomenon of the smart city, and of course, research on several themes affecting the Toronto region, not least questions of housing and urban governance. And these themes lead me nicely to an introduction of our moderator for this evening. And it's an honor to introduce Joe Mihevc, who is one of our visiting scholars at the City Institute, and whose visiting professorship at York is divided between geography and social science. And prior to his arrival at York, Joe was the city councillor for the City of York and the City of Toronto for 27 years. He has served as deputy mayor of the City of York, chair of the Board of Health, chair of the Community Development Committee, chair of the Task Force on Access and Equity, vice chair of the TTC, and vice chair of the Budget Committee, amongst other positions. He has extensive knowledge and expertise in municipal governments and governance and public policy, public health, community development, community engagement, housing policy, economic development, urban planning and redevelopment, sustainability, poverty reduction, transit planning, and newcomer resettlement. Joe also holds a PhD in theology and social ethics and has decades of experience also teaching at the university level. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, William, for the kind introduction. Yes, my name is Joe Mihevc, and I am very proud visiting professor at York University, and I'll be acting as facilitator moderator for tonight's panel. Let me just say this at the beginning. I believe that good thinking, smart thinking can make a very important contribution to social change work. Some context before I introduce the panelists. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought new urgency to the need to address the housing crisis and the suffering and loss associated therewith. The Toronto Foundation conservatively estimates that 130,000 tenants in the Toronto area are at risk of being evicted from their homes due to COVID-related rental arrears. With the second wave of the pandemic upon us and no new provincial eviction bans in sight, this panel builds on the FMTA's Taking Back Our Housing report to explore novel solutions to the housing crisis with a focus on the role of municipalities and municipal governance. The report, again, Taking Back Our Housing, that makes concrete proposals for using municipal expropriation powers to address the crisis by expanding the supply of affordable and not-for-profit housing. Other cities across Canada and internationally have been making headlines for doing something like this already. In Vancouver, City Council voted unanimously to expropriate 2 buildings in the downtown east side for $1 each, citing health and safety concerns as well as bad faith negotiations on the part of the landlord. Montreal City Council recently voted in favor of using preemptive right to purchase a vacant 6-story building in the Park Extension neighborhood to redevelop it as social housing instead of luxury condos as had been previously planned. And in Minneapolis Council successfully advocated to have their landlord's rental license revoked, staving off a wave of eviction and clearing the way for collective ownership of the building. And in Europe as well, there's a growing movement in Berlin, Germany, to have a referendum on expropriating Germany's largest corporate landlord, the Deutsche Wohnen, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, company. So these actual and proposed uses of expropriation evoke a long-standing desire of many to see that the expropriators are expropriated. Yet they also stir the specter of expropriations past, wherein the local state has facilitated the dispossession of poor, racialized, and other marginalized group. So is expropriation something that we want to support, or is it fatally flawed? Can it be a crucial measure in the struggle for affordable housing, especially at this time when housing financialization is rampant and public investment is desperately needed? This is what this panel tonight will address, with 4 questions that I will ask in a moment after introducing the panelists. We have a very distinguished panel before us, and I'd like to introduce them now. We have the wonderful councillor from Toronto, Kristen Wong Tan, who was elected to Toronto City Council in 2010 and has an extensive career investing in the city through both the public and private sectors. Her contributions have led to the development and support of improved social planning programs, new affordable housing, innovative economic and development programs, community art projects, and investments in diverse family-friendly neighborhood planning. Kristen has led efforts to defend the rights of tenants to obtain affordable and decent standards of rental housing, and has helped to create a neighborhood association to preserve and protect the heritage and historical landscapes in Toronto Centre. Do you want to wave, Councillor Wong-Tam? I'll call you Kristen. Thank you, welcome. Secondly, we have another city councillor from our neighbor big city to the north and east, and that's Craig Sauvé. He is a city councillor for the district of Saint Henri, Little Burgundy, Point Saint Charles, Griffintown in Montreal's Sud-West borough, and is an associate member of Montreal's Executive Committee for Housing. He was first elected in November 2013 in the municipal elections of Montreal, following several years of local progressive political activism on the municipal scene. Craig is also the vice president of the board of Montreal's Public Transit Corporation, La Société de Transport de Montréal. He has previously worked in federal politics as parliamentary assistant to an opposition MP for Industry, Science, and Technology. Craig holds a bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Concordia University. Give the crowd a big wave. There we go. Next, we have Cheryll Case. She practices a human rights approach to community planning. As founder and principal urban planner of CP Planning, Cheryll coordinates with charities, private sector industries, and communities to resource the systems necessary to secure a dignified living for all peoples. Through this role, she supports tenant organizing and is exploring the development of innovative models for affordable housing construction. Cheryll was a member of the City of Toronto's Expert External Advisory Committee for the 2020 to 2030 Affordable Housing Plan. Give us a wave, Cheryl. There she is. Next, we have Martine Auguste. She is an assistant professor in the University of Waterloo School of Planning. Her research focuses on housing and social inequity. Can you give us a wave, Martine? Welcome. And lastly, we have Grayson Alabiso-Cahill. He is a JD candidate at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Taking Back Our Housing, the report on expropriation and the right to housing. Grayson is excited to put his legal education to use in support of the labor movement, and he currently sits on the steering committee of the University of Toronto's Law Union. That, folks, is our panel, and we'll get right to it. The way we've organized it is around 4 questions, and different panelists will spend a little time focused on each of the questions. The first question, just to set the stage, is this, or these 2 questions. What are the primary causes and drivers of the housing crisis? And what has been the impact of the pandemic on housing issues? Now I'll invite Kristen Wong Tan to start, followed by Cheryll and then Martine. Councillor Wong Tam.
Thank you, and thank you, Joe. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to our hosts for bringing us together for this critically important conversation. And I think it's important for us to start with answering this question. And of course, there are a myriad of reasons on why the housing crisis exists today. I'm thinking about the city of Toronto, but I recognize that it is a housing crisis that's gripped most urban centers, and increasingly we're seeing homelessness fall into areas that are also very rural. I think it's important for us to cite that the deregulation of housing and sector is one of the primary drivers. If we treat it as a commodity, if we treat it as a financial instrument where its sole purpose for some people is to extract profit, and not as a home, a place of safety and dignity, a place that people can raise a family, then we will see that outcome. So this is what we're largely seeing now as the real estate sector, and all those who work in the continuum of building housing. If the drive is to create the maximum profit, then we're going to see everybody flood into that field and try to extract those profits. So that's one thing, the deregulation of the real estate market and the financialization or commodification of real estate. The other component, which I think is critically important, is just structural inequalities in life. And oftentimes that comes down to the costs of living and the wages of people are making that is not keeping up with the cost of housing. So those two have to be measured in parallel, because I don't think they can be separated. And at the core of the housing crisis, as I see it, is that if we don't try to regulate this back into a place where we can actually, number one, drive housing as a human right, and insist that we build all policies and take everything that we do as one order of government with the 3 other orders of government, and I'm thinking municipally, then we're going to not be able to fix it. And no housing crisis can be fixed by one order of government. It's got to be all 3 of us working together in order for us to address this. And right now, as I see it, we have to be able to legislate the human housing as a human right to a point that if there are federal dollars and a national government or a subnational government has adopted housing as a right, a basic right, then they need to also legislate that any dollars coming from that order of government must be therefore adopted by the sub-government. So if the city of Toronto has adopted housing as a right, then that's a good thing. But we have to make sure that the national government forces that along every municipal line until the actual end of line is built with that framework in mind.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Cheryll, over to you. Same question.
So I would say that a foundational issue that's led to the housing crisis has been the fact that when it comes to planning our cities and planning our communities, affordable housing hasn't really been the priority that it has been, that it should be. And this has been since the beginning of planning for communities in this country. So I can give you a number of different examples. I can go back as far as in 1890s, when they were people who were known as vagrants and essentially homeless people. And instead of building housing for them, they would put them in worker houses and force them to do menial tasks just to have enough food to eat and get them off the street. It wasn't to house them, it was to get them off the street. Going into the 60s, you had the boom of the single detached house, right? And the boom of that was really about prioritizing housing wealthier families, oftentimes heteronormative, like straight couples as well. And that was a huge hurt to immigrants who at that time were just Eastern European or Southern European immigrants, who were at that time racialized and otherwise by British immigrants, and women as well, who were also unable to access affordable housing. And so these things are still wrapped up within the planning process, where when we go out to communities, we're not thinking about how are we going to house these marginalized members of the public, lower income members of the public, and how are we going to push the systems internally to push a bit harder, right? From my position as a planner who practices a human rights approach, I spend a lot of time working with communities, but then also working to push planners to go a little bit further than they otherwise would. And they don't go as far as they would, because there's not a culture that's built within planning to do so. So, and the culture of that is really about asking tough questions that might be, you can consider as a little bit outside of your scope of what is in the planning, right? But it ends up producing the affordable housing. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And Martine, your perspective on the primary causes and drivers of the housing crisis.
Yeah, well, Kristen and Cheryl actually spoke to, I think, so many of the important points that I was going to mention, but I'll just go over them quickly here. First of all, we had like federal and provincial abandonment, basically, of social housing 25 years ago. And we've just seen the impacts of that stacking up year over year with the lack of supply that hasn't been built. Maybe, as we'll discuss today, expropriation will be one way we can get some of that supply back. We're also seeing, as Kristen mentioned, we've seen the deregulation of tenant protections in the province of Ontario and deregulation of rent controls. So those changes have brought in new ways to raise rents above provincially set guidelines and on vacant units. And then in addition to these cuts and deregulation, there's been this shift, as Kristen mentioned, towards financialization. And this is a shift that's been encouraged by government policy. So what do we mean by financialization? Well, it's happening both in the sphere of homeownership and in rental housing. With homeownership, we had a situation where, just as government policy was shifting away from building social housing, they started to put energy into securitizing mortgages and encouraging and ensuring risk-free profits for lenders, basically for banks. This was happening shortly after that. We had this like low interest rate environment for many years. It's just led to tons and tons of cheap debt for households, which has the effect of both indebting people, but also driving prices higher and higher. And we've just seen the effects of that. We've also seen the effects of financialization in the rental housing sector. So this is all about the rise of these financial investors who've been buying apartments as investment products and jacking up the rents as their business strategy. So those are factors that have been among the factors leading to the crisis in affordability that we're seeing today. And I want to speak also, Joe, to your second part of your question, which is what has been the impact of the pandemic on housing issues? I think a lot of people in our audience already know the answer to this, but what we've seen is that COVID-19 has just added a new layer of hardship over this existing crisis. It's really exposing the frailties in our housing system that have been created by years of government cuts and neglect, and then this financialization and private sector profiteering. So I'll speak specifically to how the pandemic is affecting rental housing. And this is the new crisis that we're seeing with evictions that are being issued against people who are experiencing financial hardship due to the pandemic. And even though there's this common language of how we're all in this together, anybody who's reading the papers knows that this economic hardship and also infections related to the virus are not affecting us equally. So we're seeing that women, immigrant women, people of color, low-income people, the elderly and disabled people are more likely to be affected by the virus and the economic hardship brought on by the virus. And so these are also the people who are going to be disproportionately hit with these evictions. And as Joe mentioned in the beginning, we're seeing these evictions are already starting. So I think all of this just underlines the need for rapid and aggressive strategies to rethink our housing system. And I think that the expropriation ideas put out in Grayson's report by the FMTA are a really exciting way to start talking about this.
Great, well, we're getting to that. Our next set of questions are around the municipal role. And I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to invite Craig to start with an answer, then Kristen, then Cheryll. What are the chief challenges for municipalities in addressing the housing crisis, and how can these be overcome? What measures exist for municipalities to address the housing crisis during this particular pandemic and beyond? What are some of the examples of leading practices with municipalities across Canada and internationally? Craig, you have the Montreal experience. You can start.
Thank you so much. Just to start off, just a real pleasure to be connecting with a great group of activists and such an illustrious panel in the Toronto area. It's a real pleasure for us in Montreal to make contacts like this. It's a good question. I think it's super important to bring this up. And I think Kristen did a good job of sort of starting to touch off on this, that all cities are not necessarily created equal. We mentioned Berlin before. They're actually a province in Germany. They're a state, and they have a lot more legislative power. And some other cities in the United States and Canada, we have different legislative frameworks. And even within Canada, within the provinces, there are different legislative frameworks for the cities. So there's certain powers that some cities have that other cities might not. So it's important that we recognize that when we start talking about what can the municipalities do, because Kristen said it, we need all three levels really to work well and in the same direction in order to get the most amount done. So, and for the Montreal, I thought I'd bring a little Montreal perspective in it. We did get some recently devolved powers in 2017 that allowed us to have a lot more rights within housing and planning. And we'll talk about this later. I'm sure you'll want to talk about our right of first refusal, which is something, as a tool we're using in Montreal now. And that's something that we had to be legislated for us by Quebec. But there are a number of other strategies that we're putting forward. We've just passed a very strong zoning and inclusion bylaw. And this bylaw may be amongst the strongest in North America, making 20% social housing obligatory or financing for 20%, including really good options for land seeding and trying to incite people to hand over the land or to build turnkey social housing. There's an affordable submarket housing component as well, and a family component as well, family housing, so 3 bedrooms or more. And that'll be obligatory for all development starting in April 1st. So something that's very strong that we're using in Montreal to bake in future affordability. But of course, we need to act right now. We are facing housing crises and a pandemic crisis across the country. So land buys are really important. So that's something Montreal is doing, is purchasing a lot of land in order to build more decommodified housing. We've put $50 million for the past few years. We've already spent about 2/3 of that for this mandate. And over the next couple of years after, we've already budgeted for $108 million also. And land is expensive, so that's small, but it's still a really good piece of it. We've also created an innovation fund for affordable housing that doesn't fit into the provincial or the federal programs, so that Montreal can directly fund housing initiatives that might not fit into other programs. And another thing we've done in Montreal is to try to improve the quality of life for people who are already renting right now. So we've really boosted the amount of inspectors we've had for housing sanitation and given them better tools and more tools to work more efficiently and to do more of the work that we need to make sure that our housing stock is in good shape and that people are respected. But overall, I'd say, I think we're talking about the same thing. And I think control of land is something that I've fleshed out as one of the main arguments written in the paper that was submitted by Mr. Alabiso-Cahill. And I think that's something that cities have to be pushing for, try to get more socialized land, more decommodified land.
Great, thank you very much. Just before Kristen starts, I would be remiss if I didn't advise you of this. There is at the bottom of your screen, there's a little section called Q&A. If you have a question that you have, or a concern or a support that you want to indicate, please put it in the Q&A section at the bottom to all of the 117 participants that have joined this session. We want you part of the conversation, and we will have there are some folks who are going to be collating some of these questions and concerns, and we will have a chance at the end, towards the end of the meeting, and panel to basically address them. Kristen, over to you. What can Toronto do around the housing crisis?
Joe, this is an excellent question, and one that I think many people are struggling to find an answer and strive to get to outcomes. And largely, I think that the conversation around housing at the municipal level has been a little bit late to the table. And it has a lot to do with Martine's point that housing was always seen largely as a federal responsibility, especially when it comes to social housing, federally capitalized and helped build, and oftentimes with the support of the province. When those two big actors left that field, there really was a void, and I don't think the City of Toronto has ever fully stepped into it thinking it would be an exclusive City of Toronto responsibility. I doubt very much any urban center thought it was their sole responsibility to build housing, just because of the financial instruments that are available to cities, because of the lack of ability to finance from beginning to end, acquisition, build, delivery, operation. It's significant, which is why probably it has not been done. There is oftentimes a proposal put forward by municipalities and sometimes by provincial governments that if the federal government steps in, then so will the province. And if the province steps in, then so will the city. So we're always looking for that tripartite arrangement. But when it doesn't exist, and when you're gripped with a housing crisis, as Toronto has been for the past few years, and definitely magnified during COVID, all bets are off, and now everyone is talking about housing. It is the big issue in 2020, but it was not the big issue when I first took office in 2010. Subways and transit was. And so if a municipality speaks about the need to expand transit, and if that's what the mayor wants, then guess what? The province and the federal government will come to the table with transit dollars. If we start talking with one unified voice at City Council that our priorities are housing and to making sure people have a dignified place to live, then the provincial and federal conversation will shift. So that's one big piece of why I believe the City of Toronto has struggled to deliver an adequate amount of housing. When Craig spoke about preeminent rights, which is the first right of refusal, or the inclusionary zoning, I know these are new tools to Montreal, but I have to tell you, I was just joyful for you and a little bit envious because we don't have any of those instruments that are available to the city, and yet we have a real quote unquote hot real estate market with a lot of global capital that comes in an extremely predatory manner, extracting as much as they want, and it is apparently relatively cheap on the global scale when it comes to big urban centers. So there is this constant narrative that Toronto has this hot real estate market, but who is it hot for and who is it benefiting? And so those are some of the big constant brush ups. One is that we don't have the powers of inclusionary zoning. The powers about expropriation, which I know we're going to get to, is not a tool that the city solicitor, I will say, looks upon favorably because it comes with some mixed results. And there's a very long and painful legal process that one has to endure before you get to the other side. So it's the last resort if they must use it, and that's how it's been explained to me. And then finally, the component is that we're also battling and competing in market forces where we're basically trying to wrestle real estate out of the hands of major global capital that perform as benevolent actors in the form of REITs, the real estate investment trust, and cities don't always want to compete in that space because they don't think that they should do it. And there's a neoliberal attitude that we don't want to interfere with the market. I don't agree. I think we should regulate. I think we should interfere. We should disrupt, but that's not the will of the majority of council, as you know. And I'm speaking to Joe in particular. Joe, you know this one very well.
Yes, yes, thank you, Kristen. Cheryll, your perspective on the role of municipalities and what they can and cannot do.
Unmuting. Yeah, so the role of municipalities, I think, would be to do the first step, which is to engage community adequately. I think the role of engagement is not just about kind of the fuzzy feelings you get from talking to people. It's the ability for community to hold planners and politicians accountable. And so you see that, for example, in the Regent Park case, where there was a really extensive engagement process, and the community is now the ones who's going to the council and going to planners and asking for the results. And so I know the City of Toronto, as one example, is looking at being more inclusive in their planning process. They just recently released their Missing Middle Open Opportunities for Housing report, in which they acknowledge that the history of planning for single detached housing in the City of Toronto has been at at the detriment of marginalized communities such as Black and Indigenous communities, as well as I would add women. So that's the first step, and in acknowledging that, that allows for them to build out a path for having more meaningful conversations with folks. It was mentioned by Martine about financialization. Kristen also mentioned this as well. It's important to note that just over the course of the pandemic, that the top 20 richest billionaires have raised they're $37 billion richer, and the 10-year national housing plan is a $40 billion plan. That's at the federal level, right? $40 billion for a 10-year national housing plan, 20 billionaires, $37 billion over 6-7 months. And so those are the types of questions that, some might say to me, it's outside of my scope as an urban planner, but it's not, right? How do we plan these? How do we finance these decisions? We're going to talk about rent control. We're going to talk about building new housing. We're going to talk about taking housing out of the market. We need to be able to talk to communities so they are prepared to make those requests of our politicians. And we actually really need to be talking to developers and asking them, where is your voice in this conversation? Right? I would love to have had this panel with Tridel, saying these things, and or another one of those the REITs talking about, we're kind of getting away with a lot right now, and it's just really easy for us to do that because we're not being held accountable at the scale at which we need to. We have great politicians like Kristen at the local level. We have provincial level great politicians, but what planning really needs to do is to be able to go out and to get people more involved politically. And one of the first steps to get people involved politically and to understand their potential is to engage them in planning processes, engage them in conversations as small as, what do you think about your rental building, and what would you like to see change there? Like, that's one of the things that I'm doing right now in Eglinton Avenue West. Actually, your former ward, Joe, is I recently won a CMHC grant where I'm working with tenants to talk about affordable housing. And the current councillor, Joe, is he's a great guy, and so I'm looking to collaborate with his office to work with the tenants to put forward affordable housing as a priority. And so what sometimes is the issue is that within the city planning offices, there is this dynamic where they're extremely risk averse to having some of those conversations about taking land out the market or having an innovative approach to reshaping the way that planning is done. I've heard directly from the community members actually that they've been pushing for affordable housing and other topics to be prioritized in the area for 5 years now. And that hasn't been put on the agenda. It's been put on the back burner. Only now, due to the current councillor, is that being put on the agenda as something to focus on. And in part, I believe it's also because that community has been able to get the help of myself. We're soon to have some Waterloo students and some Ryerson students to really push the agenda so that, if the city's not tying up along with us, then they're not going to be, part of the conversation. And I know that planners love to be a part of the conversation. So the way that happens is through partnerships. So finding ways to partner between cities and agencies outside of the city who are interested in pushing these agendas so that we can have the conversations that we need, so we can get the taxes, and so we can get policies enacted. One policy I can throw out there that I think is really a great model for how we can see affordable housing built and on a small scale. There's all kinds of scales of affordable housing creation, but on a small scale, the City of Toronto recently supported for laneways to be constructed. And there's a policy that says that if you build this laneway house as affordable housing, we will provide a $50,000 forgivable loan if you maintain it as affordable for a set duration of time. So there are these incentives that are available right now that we are able to implement. And to implement them and to install them, we need to have a proper process.
Great, thank you very much, Cheryl. Good work that you're doing in my former ward. The next question is, and this is where, Grayson, we really want you to shine. What is expropriation? In Montreal, there's that term preemptive right. Are they the same thing? Are they a little bit different? Can you explain what the difference is there? And do the expropriation proposals contained in the FMTA report chart a viable path towards expanded social and affordable housing stock? How does expropriation or similar tools, and what might they be, like preemptive right, fit within the broader scope of municipal government strategy to address housing? How viable is it? Grayson, over to you.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. And let me just say thank you all for being here and having me be a part of this. I'm thrilled to be part of such a brilliant panel. I'll start by, I guess, just addressing expropriation as I understand it in Toronto. And essentially, expropriation is like a legal mechanism that allows the government to force the sale of private property. So it's a way in which the government can subject private property rights to the public good broadly. And sort of the way the government articulates that is they can use expropriation when it is fair, sound, and reasonably necessary. And insofar as I understand it, the reason for an expropriation generally is not up to questioning by courts or by other bodies to a certain extent, but the government has to pay market compensation, as Kristen mentioned. And also, as Kristen mentioned, it is absolutely a tool of last resort. It does seem as though cities are very hesitant to use the power and only do so when it's cheap and when they feel like confident they won't face much pushback on it. So that's the broad sort of like mile high look at what it is. It's just a tool that allows a government, in our case, Toronto, but as well provincial and federal governments to expropriate, to take property without consent in exchange for a fair market value. In my report, I proposed 4 different uses for expropriation. The first was in lieu of an inclusionary zoning policy. So as Craig mentioned, and this was exciting to hear, I hadn't heard this actually, Montreal apparently just introduced one that forces developments to introduce, you said 20% of all new units need to be affordable housing. And so expropriation in lieu of that would essentially be saying the government will expropriate 15 or 20% of every new development if, for example, Toronto doesn't have the power to do inclusionary zoning. So it would sort of work in lieu of that. And there are similar negotiations that happen now, often in exchange for things like parks or public artworks. I'm forgetting the section that's used for that. Maybe Kristen will remember it, but it's kind of relatively normalized. The second proposal I had was to expropriate abandoned housing. This feels pretty clear as to why it's good, especially in such a tight market now. It feels a bit absurd to let houses sit idly by. I also would, though, include things like financialized abandonment. So looking at things like condos bought as speculative investments, left unattended or left as Airbnbs, sort of forcing or encouraging the government to take those properties for fair market value and put them to use as affordable housing, just to get more houses on the market. the abandoned housing in the more traditional sense has been done by Toronto already. So 194 Dowling was a building that was abandoned down in Parkdale that the city expropriated, and that's now run as affordable housing. I think it's run as social housing by the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center. I'm forgetting the name right now, but and that happened in the early 2000s. My third proposal was to use expropriation to punish negligent landlording. So this would be expropriating landlords who fail a certain measure of maintenance standards 2 years in a row. In Toronto, we have what's called Rent Safe Toronto, which is a grading mechanism to see how landlords are or are not meeting the requirements. And I have proposed expropriating landlords who failed to pass that grade 2 years in a row. And this also feels relatively clear on its face. It doesn't seem like it's justified to allow landlords to so negligently maintain their housing that the city itself is saying it's getting a failing grade. And instead, I would encourage the city to take those properties and to do the renovations necessary, and then from there to operate them as affordable housing. And then the final proposal I had was to expropriate any landlord over 1,000 who owns more than 1,000 units. And this was the more ambitious proposal, I would say, that I pitched. And it would essentially see the removal of financialized landlords in the city. And that to me is I think most exciting and probably most urgent if we're serious about a right to housing, and if we're serious, I think, about grappling with affordable housing for a long term. The obvious difficulty will be in funding that, and as Kristen mentioned, it would I think absolutely need to be done across all levels of government. But I think is not sufficient on its own to guarantee the right to housing, but I think a necessary step in decommodifying housing by absolutely removing the financialized landlords that exist in the city, who are, as mentioned, so predatory in their approaches and so destructive in their effects on the housing market. I will just quickly talk about why I think these are important. I want to just mostly emphasize that tenants face expropriation constantly. I think the experience of being a renter is one of precarity all the time. And we face expropriation not through the city, but through things like rent eviction, where landlords, like with expropriation, are forced to pay us compensation. I'm a renter, so I'm saying us, are forced to pay us compensation to take our property without our consent. So when you get a rent eviction notice, you don't really have any way to fight that. And it is incredibly difficult to pursue any charges after the fact. Rent eviction, for those who don't know, is the process of filing for an eviction of a tenant to renovate an apartment, often done very dubiously and very often done by these exact landlords. And so the threat of expropriation isn't novel to people in the city. It's just it's being used against the poorest of us. So I think the reason I'm proposing these policies is to essentially expropriate the expropriators, as it is commonly put the tool of expropriation to use against the people who can most afford to pay for it and are most apt and able to bear the consequences of it. It's sort of asking the question of what kind of landlords we actually want in this city and who we want to be in control of our housing. I will just quickly touch on whether I think it's a viable path. I mean, I proposed it hoping it would be, and so I like to think yes, but the money is hard, and I think that will be the hurdle. And I would say too, it is a approach to housing that is antagonistic intentionally in a way that will face opposition, I think, especially from developers and private landlords. And I think part of the reason I think expropriation is a good mechanism to be using is for exactly that reason. I think it, unlike a lot of other proposals, expands our imagination for housing in ways that allow us to make demands that are maybe unrealistic, but become more feasible in contrast. So I think of Berlin, that's been pushing for expropriation. And while they haven't won expropriation of their largest landlord, they have won a rent cap. And so I think we get to see these compromises that people in the center or on the right wouldn't make otherwise when they're faced with a viable threat of expropriation, as is coming from grassroots movements now, and hopefully, councillors bit by bit. I think I've gone over my time a little bit, so I'll stop there and I'll pass it off to the next people. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That's a very helpful explanation. Craig, can you speak to the Montreal experience and this preemptive right that has had some traction in your city? Craig?
Sure. Thank you so much, Grayson. I mean, that you pretty much sized up a report with so much more information, so that's good. And I found it very interesting to read as well. So I suggest all people who are attending this panel to check it out. In Montreal, again, it's a recent power that we were given, the right of first refusal. We had to create a bylaw in order to do it for housing in Montreal. We have a separate bylaw as well to do it for parks and other forms of like community centers and stuff. And how it works basically is that we have to pick lots that we advise people that we're We're citing your lot for first refusal if there's ever an offer made on your lot. We picked 300. And we sent, basically it's a very, administratively as well, with the way it's done, it's very heavy on the civil service. They have to send out bailiff letters to all these people, make sure they receive it and everything. And basically it's an advisory that, look, your lot is now under the subject to first refusal by the city of Montreal for 10 years. We've chosen obviously the lots in neighborhoods that we want to do more investment in social affordable off-market housing. And again, we've done it for areas that will probably be facing redevelopment. We want to have parks or a community center or something like that. And so those go out, and we did in fact use it. Now, every time somebody makes an offer on one of those lots, it's in a registry, the city is advised, and the city has 60 days to respond, whether they're going to buy it or not, for the same price, and this is important, for the same price as the offer that was made. Again, that is pretty quick for a city because it has to go through, you know, the civil service, legal departments, housing departments, executive committee, city council afterwards. So 60 days is rather fast for a city to act. But, you know, we do have these lots sort of already set out, and some are pre-analyzed, you know. So we had a really good opportunity with one lot in the Park Extension, a neighborhood that's facing rapid economic transformation, and housing prices are a very big concern there. So we were able to jump in on a project, a place that we'd hoped to acquire previously, but with the right of first refusal, we were able to get it for the same price that it was sold on the market. And sometimes that's a really good thing. And again, I can't speak for other cities or other provinces or their experiences, but sometimes when a city comes to buy a property, all of a sudden the price goes up, even if it's, you know, through some sort of expropriatory measure, the price tends to be higher, and the tribunals at the end that are going to, you know, to rule on the price, they're often a little bit higher than the market. So this right of first refusal for us so far in our experience, we're showing that the prices are just a bit better. So that's a better deal, which means if we can buy more land for off-market housing, we can get more existing units and refurbish them for affordable housing or social housing. So it's a pretty interesting tool. And another thing that's important to note with this tool as well is that it can be used for negotiations as well. So if you have a right of first refusal on a lot or two in an area that's about to be redeveloped, and a developer's coming in and asking for some sort of zoning variances, be it density, usage, whatever it means, if you've got a hold on some of the lots, they might want to negotiate with you to get certain lots in exchange for other ones in the same neighborhood, in which case you might be able to squeeze them for more money or for more land, or, you know, so there's an opportunity there. And that can be also done with the bylaw that we have for parks and community centers. So it's a really cool tool. It's complex. It can be heavy in its current form. But again, we're following what Quebec laws allow us to do. So we have to operate under their legislative framework. But it's proven to be pretty interesting so far. And it's still in its nascent stage. We're still, you know, getting used to it and looking to see whether, you know, more lots are going to be added to that list or not. But we started off with a big chunk at 300. And I think it's something that hopefully that the government of Ontario would give the Toronto power to do.
Great, thank you very much, Craig. Kristen, what about Toronto? What do you think of expropriation? And this is a new idea. I haven't heard this before, preemptive right. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, and Craig, I think when I heard about preemptive rights, the first thing I did was I actually ran to the city solicitor saying, hey, Montreal's got this new power. Should we be looking into it as well? And her response was that number one is, yes, we can look at it, and we probably should. But a couple of quick thoughts. Number one, the city of Toronto would need to have those powers. So somebody must give us the power to therefore compel the first right of refusal, so the first right to purchase. And that could be done through an amendment through the Expropriation Act, which is provincial legislation, or through the City of Toronto Act. So it's our own body of law that governs the things that we can and cannot do. So already the City of Toronto has more powers than any other city in Ontario, but many people would say it's not enough. So then the question of whether or not preemptive rights could be technically applied in a way that will allow us to extract the benefit. And I would say it can, but there are some caveats. And one of the big caveats is that we really right now are in a highly speculative market-driven real estate sector. So, and 1 acre of land in the downtown core is going to set back anybody. It doesn't matter if you're building a hospital or a condominium. The developers are driving up that acre of land, and it's sitting about $50 to $60 million per acre. That's before you do any site work, before you even plan it out. You have no idea what you're putting on there. That's just your basic land cost. So the question for the city is, can we then put ourselves in front of the other offer, the developer's offer, anybody else's offer, and meet that price, and then go about building the rest of the business plan to build whatever it is that we're looking for, whether it's hospitals or schools, or in this case, the desire to build affordable housing. So as long as the profit center is built into the speculation, cities are not building condominiums. Cities are not interested in extracting profit from the real estate. We're interested in building affordable social housing. And so it will always be a case where we will probably not be able to match the price of the other buyer who is using it for a different outcome, even if our intended outcome is for the public good. So it clearly serves a public interest component, which is why I think the preeminent right we should explore, but I think it will probably have some limitations just because our system in Ontario is so highly deregulated, not to mention we have a quasi-judicial provincially appointed land use tribunal that sits over the province called the Ontario Municipal Board, now rebranded called the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. The final decisions are not, when it comes to land use planning and development, does not rest in cities. So these are two of the biggest challenges I think about building these complete and sustainable and livable neighborhoods, is because we have this massive system of deregulation in Ontario that doesn't exist like in any other province, any other state. We're the only ones in North America that have this crazy overriding provincial body that can overrule city decisions. So already the city of Toronto, even the 4th largest city in North America, is set back in controlling how we build and grow our city. Coming back to the issue of expropriation, and I think this is a critically important component. I love, Grayson, your proposition that we push it out for discussion and make that a point of a goalpost. So therefore, having the evaluation matrix of when do we expropriate and under what terms does someone, should we expropriate, I think is critically important, because right now, in the past, it's a bit random as I see it. It is used as a threatening tool. And oftentimes the city lawyers don't even want to actually go through the formal process of expropriation. They just want to threaten expropriation and hopefully compel the seller to the table to negotiate an outcome. A willing buyer, willing seller, and an agreement that is negotiated under the mutually accepted terms. They're hoping that will accelerate the purchase. So it can be done in a way of using it as the boogeyman. We're gonna threaten you with confiscation of your real estate, and to a landowner that is not well informed, it might scare them and say, oh gosh, the city's coming to take my property. I might as well just take their first offer and be done with it. But there are a lot of real estate lawyers and municipal lawyers out there that will probably contact that owner of real estate and say, well, actually, it's not just the market value appraisal that we have to contend with. There's also other costs and damages that you could be that could be owed to you. And by the way, if you don't like the price, you can also appeal it, and we'll get you a much better price down the road. And that could be anywhere from a 2 to 3 or 5 year process. And that's oftentimes why cities don't want to use expropriation. But we have had some successes, I think, largely by just even the threat of expropriation can sometimes compel a unmotivated seller to become far more motivated.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'm going to invite Martine and Cheryll to also comment on whether expropriation is a boogeyman or a boon, and for whom it might be one or the other. And I want to also invite you to comment on this question. Given that poor and racialized people and people with disabilities are disproportionately likely to be living in unsafe and poorly maintained housing, what kinds of protections, perhaps additional protections beyond expropriation, might be put in place that does not cause harms? I'll pass it over to Martine, if you have any comments on expropriation and its ability to do things, and other options available as well. Martine?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll speak to this idea of whether expropriation is a boogeyman or a boon. I think it's just really a fascinating tool, and it has this great potential to be used to promote progressive social goals like we're discussing today. But historically, it hasn't always been this way with expropriation. It's not that common for governments to use this strong power to take from the rich and give to the poor. Across the globe, we've seen that land grabs and expropriation are typically used to privatize commonly held lands and to enrich private interests and elites. The scale of this is actually quite staggering. Getting more specific, right here in Canada, we had this major experiment with a program some of you may be familiar with called Urban Renewal in the 1960s and 70s, where there was massive expropriation in this country. So across 85 sites in Canada, nearly 20,000 households were displaced via expropriation for this program. And this is where the city was taking away private property, cities, I should say, in order to promote revitalization. So I think this is an interesting example because it wasn't that long ago, and also because the goal is potentially quite socially oriented. It's this broad sweeping goal to improve cities in the public interest. Now, in practice, this is not what Urban Renewal was about. The program operated in such a way that it was meant to enrich the business interests, and entire communities were designated as slums to justify their demolition. People also ended up not liking this program. We had a Royal Commission on Civil Rights in Ontario that found that the program was generating disproportionate hardship for low-income people, and it was destroying a lot of well-functioning communities. But to me, the fascinating precedent here is that we had this massive program which expropriated private property in the name of a potentially progressive seeming social goal. And then for a while, we had this widespread social acceptance of this practice. So it seems to me that this example shows the potential for a new era in which expropriation is used for actually progressive social goals, ones that I think on this panel we've been discussing there's a fair amount of widespread agreement about: the need for housing, the idea that housing is a human right. I think it's time for cities to be aggressive here in pursuing these goals and giving us a new era in which expropriation is used to do the right thing. Now, I'll just speak really briefly to your question about whether or not, what we can do to protect people that might be harmed by this. So I think the message from my story I just told is that there's a threat that comes with expropriation. It has been used badly in the past. And so I think we really need to have ironclad commitments with any of these types of policies, that you have a strong right to return, that there's a right for safe and adequate, affordable relocation for anybody who's relocated from these expropriations. You need fair compensation, and you need to ensure that rents are affordable and don't increase as a result of these policies. So we don't want expropriation to end up being used as a tool to promote gentrification or to, be a backdoor to social cleansing of low-income districts. We've seen that approach before, and that's not what we would want with a new version of expropriation.
Great, thank you, Martine. I would recommend to folks to look up Jane Jacobs and the work that she did in New York fighting one of the commissioners there, Moses. Great stories that are in line with what you were just speaking about, Martine. Cheryll, over to you.
Sorry. All right. So I would definitely say that expropriation would be a boon. It would be a benefit. Kristen outlined a great example as to why it's a boon. It makes an otherwise seller who otherwise may not have sold their property an owner who would be more likely to sell their property, and to actually an owner who sells their property to later be used by the city for affordable housing. I think it's also important to note that expropriation is used in other circumstances other than housing. The provincial government actually recently has been pushing for expropriation to be made easier for building transit. And the thing about transit is that transit, unfortunately, when you look at major large scale transit investments like LRTs or subways, are often actually a tool for driving profits for the private sector, right? Like when you see a new LRT being planned, you'll see the property values shoot up immediately, and you'll see a bunch of development applications going through to build huge 40, 50, 60 story towers. So expropriation is being used to derive profit for the private sector. I think that also we can consider how expropriation can be used for profit for the public sector. If you consider that providing affordable housing actually reduces public health costs, you can look at it down the line as actually it's a net benefit to expropriate property for the construction of affordable housing. And of course, on that property, perhaps you can even increase the density to a modest level so that you can actually pay for some of the costs involved in whether it be legal or otherwise in, I guess repurposing that property from privately underused housing to publicly affordable housing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Cheryl. Grayson, you've heard a lot of comments. You were the author of the report. What kinds of protections might be put in place to ensure that expropriations brings the benefits that you're looking to achieve here and does not cause harms for vulnerable people?
Yeah, thank you. I think I would start by maybe suggesting that these are people who are facing expropriation already. They're facing it through the guise of renovation and through the guise of poor maintenance. So I think it's important to bear in mind that these are people who are living in buildings that are already experiencing this process. And the question is whether we want them to be displaced in the pursuit of private profit, or whether we want them to have a say in how and what happens in those buildings and what they can do to prevent displacement. I think I would note that I don't think expropriation is necessarily the same as displacement. And I think there's ways we can go about expropriation, as have been mentioned, that prevent displacement, whether it's through like legal methods of requiring, rights of first refusal for tenants who are displaced, but things like a duty to consult and sort of what Cheryl has talked about in consulting with communities, engaging communities there, I think would be a crucial part of this. And I think expropriation is a troublesome, depending on who is wielding it, is sort of how I think of it. And I think expropriation in the context that I hope I've talked about it is coming from grassroots organizations. Like I look to the Encampment Support Network, who are organizing around people living in encampments in Toronto, calling for the expropriation of the We Charity building, I think on Sherbourne Street. And I look at OCAP, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, who's called for also expropriation of building on Sherbourne Street. And so I think that's a core difference between the kinds of expropriation that we've talked about that are problematic and troublesome, and the kind of expropriation I think we should be calling for and pushing for alongside these community members, not over them, very, very importantly. I also think it's important to think about what will happen without expropriation or without a push to bring these people into socially owned affordable housing, especially in the context of COVID, where we've already seen, I think it's something like 1,600 evictions this week. Like these are people living in these buildings who are facing eviction very immediately in a pandemic. The question to me is really, do we let that happen or not? And expropriation is a mechanism of many that allows us to prevent that from happening and to give these people control and autonomy over what happens in their building. Just on a last point, I would say that, if we're thinking about expropriating buildings that are facing maintenance issues, not all of these buildings are at capacity. In fact, most of them have empty units. And I think there's a way we could approach expropriation of these buildings that allow for repair in the building, but without displacing anyone, by having people live in units that are, in the same building, but shuffling them around. Like it seems to me as though there's some logistical issues that we could use to solve some of the issues that I think we're concerned about arising, which is not to say that I don't think we should be not concerned about it. I think it's absolutely a concern. We don't want expropriation to be used continually and as it has been in the past by those with power against those without power. We need to make sure that as we use expropriation in the context of affordable housing, it's benefiting those who are who will most benefit from that affordable housing. So I guess that's sort of my loose thoughts on some general ways to think about how we can make sure it doesn't displace people and it actually helps them.
Great. Back to you, Cheryl, just for a minute to allow you to have some comments that you wanted to share around protecting vulnerable people if expropriation made its way through the governmental system.
Yeah, so just to make it quick, I think that's where planners come in, right? So you see people, they're going to be displaced for a period of time while maybe the property is rehabilitated to a livable standard. In those cases where the property is not a livable standard, or what we would consider decent, you plan to build another home within the neighborhood, most likely and most preferably in a rapid manner. So we've seen recently with the City of Toronto, with the modular housing, being able to build hundreds of units in 6 months, right? So how else can modular units be used to develop temporary housing for that interim period between them being displaced and then returning back to their home?
Okay, over to you, Craig. Montreal, you've heard some comments on the Toronto scene. Is there anything that stands out to you here that the Montreal experience might be helpful in the Toronto, Southern Ontario scene?
Well, I just think it's a really interesting discussion around expropriations, and in fact, it is an exciting place to start looking for some solutions. But again, I think Kristen really put it well. Like, there are certain powers that certain cities have, and for all you activists out there, for housing activists, yes, come to see your city councillors, ask us, push us. That's important. Don't forget, your MPPs and your provincial government, because they hold so much of the keys to power for the cities. I don't know how Toronto's actual framework is, but in terms of ability to levy taxes or revenue, capacity to have deficits or not on the operational budgets, we don't have those capacities in the cities. We lack a lot of the legislative framework to do some of the cool things that cities around Europe or in the States can do. So that's one big frustration. And so, work with the activist group, all the activists, and remember that you have to put pressure on the other levels of government as well in order to empower cities that want to do something cool. If you have a city council that wants to move forward with progressive initiatives, you need the provincial partners there too. So I think that's really important. And again, the expropriation right of first refusal or preeminent right that we have in Montreal is one tool that we're using of many tools. There's a buffet of options that we're using. Again, just land buys in and of itself. We've played around with our zoning bylaws in a lot of our boroughs in Montreal in order to stem the tide of rent evictions by no longer allowing types of divisions and fusions of units to give less reasons, for example, for malintentioned owners to start rent evicting people. There are different ways we can approach these actions, and creating programs. There's so many different things that can be done. And I mentioned too the sanitation issue in cities. I don't know what the responsibilities of our Toronto in it, but we've doubled the amount of inspectors in Montreal. So there are people that are living in very stressful circumstances with bed bugs, with mold, with improper heating, and they're trying to leave their apartments. There's not enough affordable, we know, but can we help those people have comfort in their homes? Are there some tools that we can give our sanitation departments, legal tools that they might not have? Or are they just functional organizational tools? Like, instead of before in Montreal, they used to write everything on a pad and paper. And now we gave all our teams iPads, and we created structures, and we gave them a lot better, organizational tools as well, so that we can move quicker and try to reduce the time that a complaint comes in and then there's an actual resolution. So there's a broad, I think, offering of tools that I think need to be explored. But this certainly what's provided in the report. There's some really interesting conversations that I think can push and start questioning the provincial authorities. Like, hey, you don't want to stand up for your tenants. You don't want to stand up for people that are trying to pay and have an honest life, and you don't want to give them a place to stay. You're not going to stand up for the vulnerable people that need an extra hand. Then what are you not doing as a government? So keep it up, activists, and it's great to hear from you and to see you.
Great, I love this Montreal-Toronto dialogue that's happening. We have had lots of questions, 37 questions that our wise owls at the FMTA have put together into 3 questions. So I'm going to read the summaries of 3 questions and invite each of the 5 panelists to answer any one of their choosing, but you only have 90 seconds. So you have to think on your feet and very quickly, just so that we can commit to stay on track with our 8:30 promised finished. So now question number 1 is, many people in the chat are asking about the definition of affordable housing. In a few words, how do the panelists believe we should define affordable housing, for whom and for how long? A second question is a lot of interest in the chat about land value and municipal regulations. Why does the city have to pay market value for land when market prices are being pushed up arbitrarily by developers, REITs, and the financialization of the housing market? Can the city regulate this, and how can it regulate it? And thirdly, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of public-private partnerships when it comes time to securing affordable housing? What role could nonprofits play in securing affordable housing? Let's go backwards and start with Grayson. 90 seconds to 2 minutes. What do you think of those 3 questions?
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be fast. I think I can maybe get through.
Wait, slow down. I want to be able to hear what you say, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
A bit slower. I'll answer the first one about the question of how I would define affordable. I mentioned this in my report. I would say affordable should be tied to income. It should be 30% of your income-ish. I mean, it could be 5% of your income. I guess I just wouldn't go over 30% is how I would define it. And it should be for everybody and for as long as they are renting a home, is my quick short answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Cheryl, maybe pick another question. Over to you.
So I'll answer 2. So the first is that, or I'll answer the one I remember, actually, I forgot the second. So I would define affordable housing as what is affordable to the individual. So people who, for example, if you make an income of, if you're on WSP or whatever, ODSP, 30% of your income might make sense, it might not make sense. I just want whatever allows people to live a decent life and to have some free money to go out and enjoy arts and culture. I think arts and culture is one of the things that make life worth living. That might be, paying for your internet or being able to go to a show, right? Those are so important for having a vibrant, healthy community. The second question I'm remembering now is about public-private partnerships. In the public-private partnership, the private partner shouldn't be getting a sweet deal where they end up making more money than perhaps they would have otherwise. The private partner, in many cases, should be looking to, in a way, donate or provide services that allow them to break even or to develop a very modest profit.
Okay, thank you. Maybe next we could go to Martine.
Hi, so I'll also talk to the same 2 questions that have already been answered. I think some of us maybe forget the second one. But yes, I agree. Housing affordability is one of these issues that's being discussed right now. And there's an interesting shift that happened in our history where we used to define, the way we used to define affordable housing was gearing it to one's income. And if you paid more than 30% of your income towards housing, that housing was considered to be unaffordable. And back even further, we had lower thresholds. At one point it was 25%, and before that 20%. So the definition keeps changing. We've recently shifted away from defining affordability based on one's income, and we're now defining it based on the market. So you'll see that in a lot of government programs, affordable is defined as a certain percent of average market rents, 100% of average market rents, or 80% of average market rents. That's not affordable. And so I think these are really good questions. I saw them all in there. I saw Auguste ask that question, and I'm really excited that we get a chance to talk about it. And this is something that we should really be pushing on. Otherwise, all these affordable housing programs that we're getting are giving us housing that, people who are getting pushed out to build that affordable housing can't even live in. I'll just really briefly talk about the PPPs, public-private partnerships. I don't see why there's much need to have private partners involved in delivering affordable housing. We got to eliminate the middleman, which is the one that is taking a profit from it, and provide this housing in a way where it is affordable for people who live in it, and there's no need to actually have that segment of the money going to the private sector partner just as profit.
Great, thank you. Craig, over to you. Maybe the second question was around why does the city have to pay market value? And does it have any tools to not pay market value when it
I'd love
buys?
to just, I asked about the Vancouver situation to our city as well, hearing that there was some buildings that were taken for $1. I'm sure they're going to find their way into court and they're going to have a long, lengthy court battle and it might go pretty high. But effectively, in a lot of the cities don't have the legislative power necessarily to do such things, and their property rights involved there. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have specialities in that, but we're sort of stuck with some of our expropriation laws the way they are in regards to other property laws. So that's a frustration. Even in Montreal and Quebec, I don't know if you have the same powers in Toronto. We have land freezes where we call it réserve foncière, where you can actually freeze a piece of land that you want to negotiate before you have to expropriate. And if you just freeze the land, and we can do that in Montreal, we can do that for 4 years before you actually expropriate. Just freezing the land, you're sort of halting the development rights. And so if you don't end up buying by agreement or expropriating, then they can come sue you for taking away their development rights within the 4 years. So we were still lacking that power. But I think the big important thing is the levels of government have to be mobilized. And so governments who are mobilized, levels that are, can push. And if all three levels are mobilized, well, they can create more opportunities, purchase more land together, make better programs. That's all possible, but we need that mobilization at all three levels.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Kristen, any thoughts on any of those three questions?
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe, and thank you to all of you for your answers. They were so eloquent. With respect to the P3 model, which is the public-private partnership, I absolutely agree with Martine, is that we have to be able to remove the private piece, because we've been fed this incredible scoop of ice cream that only the private sector can deliver housing or any type of public infrastructure, and because we transfer the risk to them, and it's hogwash. But the problem here has always been the upper orders of government, whether it be the province or the national government, has oftentimes compelled cities to engage in private-public partnerships if we want their money. So therefore, if Toronto wants money from Ontario, we have to use their deliver of construction, which is Infrastructure Ontario, which goes out to the market. So we're stuck if we want their money. When it comes to land values and stripping away the profit center for the property owner, I don't know how that is done without us becoming a totalitarian state. There are places in the world where you can, as a government, seize the private assets of a company, or perhaps nationalize land or utilities. We don't have those. Well, we do have those powers, but we don't necessarily have those powers when it comes to trying to seize that from the private citizen or what have you. And I think that we would have to really flip our model upside down. The one thing I would put out there, and I'm just going to finish on this, is that we need to treat housing like healthcare. Housing should be a function, a social function that belongs to each and every single one of us. And if we then turn the paradigm upside down, I think we will be able to then repurpose the whole conversation that allows us to think of housing as a true right, just like water, just like healthcare, like education. And then it's no longer the same type, left to the same forces of market debate. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Kristen. And it's approaching 8:30, our agreed to time to close. I want to just thank everyone on this panel, Kristen, Craig, Cheryl, Martine, Grayson. That was one heck of a great conversation. A lot of lights were going on in my head as to possibilities and options and ways to really expand our horizon around how we see affordable housing in this city, in this province, and in this country. So thank you to the panelists on behalf of all of the attendees. I want to pass it on now, the electronic baton, to Chiara Padovani, the amazing Chiara, and she'll speak on what is next. Over to you, Chiara.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to all of our panelists for that very stimulating discussion on the future of housing in Toronto and across this country. We heard a lot in the discussion about the challenges that we're facing in Toronto and in Montreal and in other cities in Canada. And if you're a tenant and you're living in this housing crisis, it can feel extremely isolating. It can feel really alone. And now during COVID, even more so. But I just want to take a moment to say that you're not alone. And together we are strong. And in fact, the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations was founded on that principle, that together we are strong. And so on behalf of the FMTA, I wanted to take a moment to invite everyone who was participating, who tuned in, to think about and reflect on some of the things that we talked about during the panel and how we can put that into action. And that's going to look different for different people and different groups. But here at the FMTA, I wanted to invite you to take action in one of three ways. And I'm going to be dropping some links into the chat, so do stick around to tune in. The first way is that you can take part in our tenant school. It's starting tomorrow, and it is a great way to learn about your rights as a tenant and how to organize. The link will be in the chat for everyone to see. The second way is to volunteer for the FMTA. You know, we would love to have you on your team. We are trying to build a bigger movement of tenants and tenant power in the city. And then the final thing is, I have always believed that the single most important thing we can do in a response to this housing crisis is to organize. And that is organizing on your street, in your building, organizing a tenant association. And so I'm gonna add also in the chat some resources from the FMTA. I know that can sound like a daunting task to organize a tenant association, but lean on us, contact us, use the resources and the toolkits that we have, because that's how we are stronger together. And without further ado, I would like to now turn it over to Jean-Michel for closing remarks from the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies.
Thanks, Kiara, and thanks to our panelists, Kristen, Cheryll, Martine, Craig, Grayson, as well as our moderator, Joe, for an insightful event. Thanks also to the FMTA, the City Institute, for their collaboration in hosting this important and timely discussion, as well as the organizers, including Jessica, Kiara, Patricia, William, but also Pamela Fan, Laura Tamman, and Alex Felipe at the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies. On behalf of the Robarts Center and its Civis Research Cluster, I hope you will keep an eye on future events and initiatives we are planning to better understand urban governance and citizenship in Canada. We will also send all of you a follow-up email after the event with more information on Civis, as well as the FMTA and the City Institute. It's now time to close the event, so thanks to the audience for your attention, interest, and participation, and I wish you all a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.